we began a journey together. And it's a journey that I know that every one of you want to be a part of. You want to be a journey because our journey is walking with Jesus. In short, you are here today because you want to walk with Jesus. And that's just a goal of our lives. That's something we want to do. But a lot of times we struggle with that. So for 7 weeks, we're going to look at the life of Jesus chronologically. And we're going to see some of the things that through his ministry, through his time here on this earth, so that we can pattern our lives after him. Because if we're going to walk with Jesus, we need to be like Jesus. Last week we found out it wasn't as easy as we thought it might be. Because the first thing, after Jesus began his public ministry, he was baptized by John in the Jordan River. And immediately following that, he was taken into the desert where he was tempted by Satan. And Satan tempted him in every way possible that he could possibly tempt him. And we kind of knew how that felt. Because for some of us, we decided, hey, we want to follow Jesus Christ. We surrender our life to him. We're obedient to be baptized. And when we do that, all of a sudden, God just seems like he lets Satan do anything to us. Satan's tempting us, and that temptation's there. And before you know it, we start thinking, well, I want to do this. I want it my way. And we start getting into all this. Temptation is there in our life. Just like it was in Jesus' life. That's normal. I want you to know that if you are living for Christ, Satan don't like it. He don't want you following Christ. He knows he can't have your soul. It now belongs to Jesus. But he don't want you to grow. He don't want you to tell others about Christ. He don't want you to become more stronger in your faith. He's going to do everything he can to keep that from happening. And that's going to come through temptation. And that temptation is going to cause you to doubt. That temptation is going to cause you to do all kinds of things because he doesn't want you to grow. And every once in a while I have folks say, well, Pastor Ed, I don't know that I'm being tempted by Satan. So then I tell them, you need to ask yourself, do you really belong to Jesus? Because if you don't belong to Jesus, Satan's not really worried about you. So we need to ask ourselves that question as well. But Satan will tempt believers. But this morning, I want you to know that the Christian life is more than just temptation. Jesus tells us that in this life, he will bring us joy. And so I want us to look at the joy of being a Christian. But before we get into that, I want to ask you a question. And this is something I want you to think about. When you take your whole church experience and look at it as a whole, does your church experience more resemble a wedding or a funeral? Now, really, I'm serious. Does your church experience, not just one particular Sunday, but your time in church, whether it's been 2 weeks or whether it's been 200 years? None of you have been here that long, I know that. But looking at that, does your church experience resemble more a wedding or a funeral? Now, I can tell you, here at Old Fields Baptist Church, we really try to structure a service to be more like a wedding. Because we all know weddings are fun, most of the time. Weddings are exciting, and we've had a couple weddings in our church this month, and some of you have been a part of weddings, and there was a ton of weddings around our community yesterday. So weddings are fun, but does anybody ever say, I can't wait to go to the next funeral? I don't know anybody that's ever said that. Because funerals are not fun. Now, I want you to know, church is not all about just fun. What a church does has to be biblical. And you have to make sure that what's being taught is the Word of God. But we don't have to feel like we're in a morgue when we come to church. Maybe the temperature, yes, that's okay. You let the fat man control the thermometer and we're going to be comfortable. But here's the thing. We don't have to live a life like that. But I can tell you, my church experience always hasn't been like a wedding. I can remember times when I dreaded going to church. I thought I hated everything about it. And I blamed everything as to why my church experience was like a funeral. I blamed the preacher. The preacher's old. The preacher's slow. The preacher goes on and on and on and on. What y'all nod your heads for? But I would blame the music. And you can fill in the blank with your blaming the music. Because we've all done it at some point. The music's too soft, the music's too loud, the music's too long, the music's too short, the music's too fast, the music's too slow, the music has this, the music doesn't have this. I remember one time a person came out of a church and said, Satan is in this church. And I was like, why do you say that? They had drums. I'd love to have drums. But all we have in our church is drummers, and we can't have just drums. So we got to add some more instruments to that. But here's the thing. We can blame everything. And we can always make it somebody else's fault. But here's what I finally realized. I realized the problem with why my church experience was more like a funeral than a wedding wasn't anything else but me. The problem was my relationship with Jesus. Because when I learned to love Jesus and love him back through my worship, all those other things began to change. That's where the joy comes from. So today, as we follow Jesus, I want us this morning to follow him to a wedding. So pack your bags. We're going to Cana. Let's begin in John chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It says, 3 days later, a wedding took place in the city of Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. Jesus and his disciples had been invited too. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they're out of wine. Jesus said to her, why did you come to me? My time has not yet come. His mother told the servers, do whatever he tells you. 6 stone water jars were there. They were used for Jewish purification rituals. Each jar held 18 to 27 gallons. Jesus told the servers, fill the jars with water. The servers filled the jars to the brim. Jesus said to them, pour some and take it to the person in charge. The servers did as they were told. The person in charge tasted the water that had become wine. He didn't know where it had come from, although the servers who had poured the water knew. The person in charge called the groom and said to him, everyone serves the best wine first. When people are drunk, the host serves cheap wine. But you have saved the best wine for now. Cana in Galilee was a place where Jesus began to perform miracles. He made his glory public there, and his disciples believed in him. After this, Jesus, his mother, brothers, and disciples went to the city of Capernaum and stayed there a few days. Now, as we look at this passage this morning, I want us to break it down and look at what the passage is teaching us. And then I want to give you 3 thoughts from this passage. So when we start out in the passage, and it says, 3 days later, a wedding took place in the city of Cana in Galilee. Now, we often just look over that. We know the wedding took place in Canaan. I learned that as a kid. That first miracle of Jesus was when he turned the water into wine. Story done, move on. But here's the thing we have to understand. This account is written by the Apostle John. And when John gives a detail, like it was the 3rd day, we need to take a moment and look, because to us the 3rd day doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean a lot. Okay, it was the 3rd day, so does that mean it was Tuesday? Does that mean it was Wednesday? How do they count their week? We can ask all these questions. But when John gives a detail, here's the thing I want you to know about the Gospel of John. When John gives specific details like that, it's because it has meaning. And most of the time, it'll have 2 meanings. It'll have a literal meaning, but it'll also have a spiritual meaning. The literal meaning here, the 3rd day. That's the travel time that it took from where they were in Judea to Cana. So John's giving us a reference to how long it took. Remember, they walked. They didn't get in a car and drive. They didn't fly. They didn't take a bus. They didn't call an Uber. They walked. So Johnstown was on the third day. So that's the time it took to get from where they were to where the wedding was in Cana. Jesus had been in Judah. And in Judea, he had all these things going on, and he'd been doing some things there, and he was calling some of his disciples and those to follow him. We know by this time he had at least 6 disciples. We're not sure if he's called the others at this time or not, but we know he has at least 6. And maybe you're familiar with the calling of the disciples and how Jesus did that. Some of them were fishing, and he called them, and they, after catching the greatest catch they ever caught in their life, they left it to follow Jesus. One of my favorite stories when Jesus is calling his disciples is the story of Philip. Philip is friends with Andrew, and they meet this guy, and Philip believes this may be the Messiah. They meet Jesus. And Philip believes it may be the Messiah. So Philip goes and tells his friend Nathaniel. And he tells him, he says, I've met this guy that I believe could be the next king of Israel. I think I have just met the Messiah. And as he runs to Nathaniel, he tells him, I've just found the Messiah. His name is Jesus. He comes from Nazareth. Well, when he said that, Nathaniel kind of like, wait a minute, Nazareth? Because you see, Nathaniel was actually from Cana. Cana and Nazareth is only just a few miles apart, so he knew all about the people from Nazareth. Nazareth was kind of a little nothing town, if you know what I mean. Nothing good ever happened there. Nothing ever took place there. It was just kind of a nothing little town. And now, Philip comes and says, we just met the Messiah. He's from Nazareth. And here's what Nathaniel asks. He says, is there anything good that comes from Nazareth? But here's what I love about the story. I love Philip's response. All Philip says is, come and see. Come and see. He doesn't give him anything else. No argument, no discernment, no prologue about how he thinks this is the Messiah. All Philip says is, come and see. Now we've been into a journey to follow Jesus. And I could argue with you all day why we need to follow Jesus. But here's what I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you to come along on this journey and just see for yourself who Jesus is and why we should follow him. Nathaniel did, and his life was changed. Here's what it says in John chapter 1, verse 49. Then Nathanael declared, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Now, all this stuff's happened. 3 days later, they've taken a hike. They're now in Cana, and there's a wedding in Cana. And we don't know a lot about the wedding, but there's things we can pull out from the story. But when you think of a wedding, you think of a modern-day wedding. And there's so many things about a wedding that makes it so special. I've yet to be at a wedding that the bride didn't look beautiful. And when you're thinking away, you're thinking white dress, and you're thinking flowers, and you're thinking music, and from our culture, we're thinking this wedding is wonderful. Well, as a pastor, let me tell you something. Weddings are not always wonderful. There's a lot of stress there. I find folks that by the time they get to that day where they're standing before the pastor and they're ready to, they're just ready for it to be over with. I can't tell you the number of folks that by the time they get to that point, they say, I just wish we'd have went off and unloaded somewhere. Could we have just done this in your office with nobody? I hear this all the time. And weddings aren't always wonderful. Holly and I attended a wedding one time that they asked the state police to come and guard the door for the wedding. Weddings can be very, very stressful. But you think a wedding can be stressful in our day and time? You should have been back in John's day and time. Because a wedding was a whole lot more than what it is today. Today when we think of weddings, we think of a couple that meet and they fall in love and they just want to spend their eternity together. Anybody ever been there? Everybody that's married better be nodding your head, especially if your spouse is looking at you. Yes, but here, and somebody's going, ooh, my spouse is not here. I could be honest. But in Jesus' day, a wedding was more than just uniting a couple. Most of the time, the weddings were prearranged. There are many times that on this wedding day, the bride and the groom are meeting each other for the very first time. Because the wedding's been arranged by their parents. They don't have a choice in the matter. And now they're coming together, not just to unite as husband and wife, but they're coming together to unite two clans. Two families are now becoming one. And that is very, very important. It's a big deal when a wedding took place in Cana. But let's go on with the story a little bit. The rest of verse 1, verse 2 says, Jesus' mother was there. Jesus and his disciples had been invited too. So we know that in the story, Jesus is at the wedding. We know the disciples are at the wedding. We know that Mary's at the wedding. And Mary's not only at the wedding, but Mary seems to be in charge. Because we already read the story, so we know what happens. They're running out of wine, and she comes to Jesus, they're out of wine. So most of us wouldn't care. Mary's in a position where she's concerned about that. So we believe that she's probably in charge there. And you say, what's the big deal? What if you do run out of wine? Keep in mind, you are uniting two clans. Cake and punch isn't going to do it. This is the groom's way of proving to the bride's family that he can take care of her. And when he takes care of her, he's taking care of them as well. This is his way of proving. The wedding feast, it wasn't just a couple hours in the fellowship hall of the church. This is a 7-day experience. And the groom is required, he's going to feed everybody. If you can imagine this wedding feast in today's time, it's going to be full buffet, open bar. That's what the wedding would be like. But go on to verse 3, it says, when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they're out of wine. Again, we think that's still a deal, right? They're out of wine, so they're out of wine, drink water. By now we might be at day 4, 5, 6. They probably need to sober up and go home anyway, so don't worry about it. That's going to be our fault. But keep in mind, this is the groom's way of proving he can take care of this woman as well as her whole family. To run out of wine, that was unheard of. That was a disgrace to him and his family. Matter of fact, this was so important that in that day there was a law that if the groom could not provide for the wedding reception, then the bride's family could back out of the wedding and sue the groom and his family. That's how important it was when they were running out of wine. So Mary brings this problem to Jesus. She comes and she just tells him that there's no wine. Now, from the rest of the verses, we kind of get the idea that Mary's expecting Jesus to do something about it. What did she expect him to do? I really don't know. I'd love to tell you that because, we know when Jesus was born and all the folks was coming to visit, our Bible tells us that Mary pondered all these things in her heart, and she'd had that encounter with the angel that told her she was carrying this. I'd like to think that Mary knew that, hey, Jesus is going to do something spectacular, but we don't know that. Here's what we do know. We know that Jesus was invited to this wedding, and his disciples were too. In that day, the custom was, if the teacher had a need, those who had chosen to follow that teacher were bound to meet that need. So all Jesus would have had to do was look at his guys and go, guys, we need wine. And they'd have had to went wherever and get that wine and bring it. That was just the custom of the day. They had bound themselves to Jesus as his disciples. They could have. So we don't really know what Mary expected there, but here's what she comes to Jesus and says. They have no wine. Look at Jesus' response. Jesus says, why do you come to me? I love how it says it in the King James. Woman, I don't care who you are, I do not recommend that. But he said, why do you come to me? My time has not yet come. Now, when we read that in our culture, in our day, in English, oh, it sounds like he is giving it to his mama. And you're ready for hands to fly, right? I mean, he might be 30 years old, but he's going to get it. That's how we look at it. Jesus wasn't disrespecting his mom. He really wasn't. What Mary was doing was asking Jesus, as the oldest son, to handle a family problem. We believe because Mary was in charge that they were probably family. Whoever was getting married was family to Jesus and to Mary and to all that. So she's asking Jesus, the oldest son, to handle a family problem. You notice Joseph's not mentioned. When Joseph and Mary got married, Joseph was probably like 30 years older or maybe more than that than Mary. So Joseph's probably dead. That means that Jesus, as the oldest son, is now the head of the family. But here's what Jesus is telling her. His ministry to the Heavenly Father has already begun. He's been away from his family now for about 9 months. And he's saying to her, not to disrespect her, but he's telling her that he can't leave God's work for the whole world to take care of a family problem. But I like Mary's response. She just looks at the servants and says, you just do whatever he tells you. And listen to what he tells them. Verse 6 says, 6 stone water jars were there. They were used for Jewish purification rituals. Each jar held 18 to 27 gallons. Jesus told the servers, fill the jars with water. The servers filled the jars to the brim, and Jesus said to them, pour some and take it to the person in charge. And the servants did what they were told. Now, here's what we know about the jars. They were for ceremonial washing. They were, it's not what we think either when we think of washing. You know, we're not thinking, we think that somewhere at the wedding feast, you know, they got a wash station where there's probably a thing of soap and you give yourself a couple pumps and then that's not what this was. The Jews had a belief that they had to be ceremonial clean before they could eat. And it really had nothing to do with cleanliness. I don't even know that they knew back then what germs were. There was nothing antibacterial. But what they would do is they would do a ceremonial cleansing where usually they would start with their right hand and they would pour water from their hand and let it roll down over their elbow. And then they would do their left hand, and then because their right hand may have come in contact with the left hand that was still dirty, they would do the right hand again. And it would just be pour a little water over, done. And that was what the water was used for. So the pots is sitting there, and Jesus tells them, go and fill these pots up. And they did. You know, Mary said, whatever he says, do it. Then he says, go and take some to the person in charge. Now, some of your translations is going to say it's the master of the feast. Some of your translations will say it's the governor. We really don't know who it was, but we know this is the most important person at this wedding. And Jesus says, take him a drink from there. Now, let's imagine you were the servants. You filled that pot. What did you put in it? Water. And now Jesus says, take it and give it to him. Yeah, that's probably what I would think as well. Yeah, right. But remember, they're servants. Do whatever he tells you to do, so they go. Now, would you have boldly walked up and gone, hey, buddy, here, have a drink? Oh, you spilled half of it before you got there? But you get there, and you give it to him, and he takes a drink. And look what Jesus did. They filled those things up with water, but now it was wine. And not only any wine, this was the best wine because he calls the groom over. Now, can you imagine that servant about that time? When this guy takes a drink and he gets this funny look on his face, and you're standing there with knees knocking and hands are trembling, and all of a sudden he goes, hey, groom, come here. You probably would wet yourself. But he says, most folks wait till everybody gets drunk, and then they bring out the junk stuff. But you didn't. You saved the best wine till now. Now, I've told you this whole story because I want you to see what happens when you invite Jesus into your story. What happens when you invite Jesus into your relationship with him? I want to give you this morning three things. Three things that help us to bring joy from this passage into our relationship with Jesus. And as you listen to that story, I'm going to guess you've already figured them out. But let's look at them together. Number one, for joy in your relationship with Jesus, you need to invite Jesus into your unjoy. Now, my computer says that's not a word, but it is today. Invite Jesus into your unjoy. Whatever that's happening in your life that's taking away the joy of your relationship with Jesus, invite Jesus into that. We could say whatever our problem is. What was the problem at the wedding? There was no wine. Jesus, there is no wine. Do whatever he says. We need to invite Jesus into whatever our problem is, whatever we're struggling with, and just think it could be anything. Our struggle today that is taking away the joy of our salvation, the joy of our relationship, it might be a family problem that's doing it. Let's invite Jesus into that family problem. It might be a marriage problem. Let's invite Jesus into that marriage problem. It might be an illness or a sickness. Let's invite Jesus into that. I mean, whatever that problem is, maybe it's a church issue. Maybe it's a personal issue. Whatever our problem is, to have joy in our relationship with Jesus, it begins by inviting Jesus into our unjoy. Remember what happened when they told him there was no wine? He took water. Ordinary water that comes from a dug well somewhere. Put it into a pot. And turned it into not just wine, but the best wine. Folks, I think we need to invite Jesus into our unjoy. Now, I started by telling you that when John gives you a detail, he does it with meaning. And the literal meaning of the 3 days was it took 3 days to get from where they were to the wedding. But I believe anytime John gives a detail like that, it has a spiritual meaning as well. I just want you to think through what you know of the Bible. What else happened in 3 days? Jesus rose from the dead, didn't he? So we might look at our problem and we go, well, my problem's bigger than water and wine. That don't mean anything to me. But is our problem bigger than death and life? Jesus can handle it. So we need to bring Jesus into our unjoy. I want to ask you this. Just you and God, be honest. What is it in your life right now that's causing you the struggle of having joy in your relationship with Jesus? Are you willing to bring Jesus into that? Because if you do, look at my second thing. When we invite Jesus into our joy, then we need to obey what Jesus says. I mean, look at the story. We've already agreed, we're the servant, we have to do what he says, but we're not boldly going to take that glass of water, we think, to the most important person with eagerness. But we have to be willing to obey what Jesus says. And whatever's going on in our life that's causing such problems, Jesus has the answer in his word. He'll reveal that to us through his Spirit. As we pray, he'll let us see that answer. But we have to be willing to obey what Jesus said. Sometimes the things that Jesus asked us, or the direction that he's going to lead us, may not even make sense to us at the time. doesn't ask us to make sure it makes sense. He just asks us to be obedient and do whatever he says. So we invite Jesus into our unjoy. We obey what Jesus said. And then the third thing, that's where the joy comes. Enjoy what Jesus does. They brought him a problem. We have no wine. And they took these pots and filled them up, and some of you have already done the math. That's about 180 gallons of the best wine ever. I don't know anything about wine, folks. I don't have anything. I'm not going to try to give you a comparison as to what that is. But here's what I want you to know. When you invite Jesus into your problem, doesn't mean he's going to take care of that problem immediately, but he's going to help you through it. You'll be stronger because of it. You'll have a deeper faith because of it. You're going to be obedient and do whatever he says. And when that happens, Jesus will bless you. You can enjoy what he does. And I want you to know, when Jesus blesses you, he really, really blesses you. I started with a question. Your church experience, does it resemble more a wedding or a funeral? And I've already told you, it has nothing to do with the preacher and how long he went on. Has nothing to do with the songs we sing. I mean, you notice here in a little bit, we're going to end our service with a peppy song, something that we're going to sing for the rest of the day. It has nothing to do with that. Whether our relationship with Jesus is more like a wedding or a funeral, has to do with us. Has to do with you and I. Maybe our attitude, maybe our actions, maybe our obedience, maybe our surrender, but it has to do with us. You enjoying your relationship with Jesus? Then I want to ask you, as we sing this next song, take that time and pray. And invite Jesus into your unjoy. Take whatever it is that the Spirit has revealed to you that right now this is your struggle spiritually. Invite him into it. As you don't just, oh Lord, help me here. You have to be willing to obey and do what he says. To follow him, be patient, and let him guide. But then I can promise you, you will enjoy what Jesus does. Because when Jesus blesses, he really blesses. So as we sing this song, why don't we stand? Let's just take a moment and pray. Invite him into our body. Maybe you want to come to the front. Let's do this. Let's just open up the front of our church. This is our altar. We're not only going to pray, we're going to take that problem and we're going to bring it to Jesus and we're going to lay it there. And then we're going to commit to obey him and follow him. And let him bring joy to our relationship. Let's pray together. Lord God, thank you so much. So much for your word. For the story that we know is the first miracle of Jesus and all that great thing, but a story that shows us how to have joy in our relationship with you. And Lord, I pray for every person here that today when we leave this place, we will know that we've begun the process of having joy in our relationship with you. So Lord, thank you for hearing our prayers. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Would you stand with us, please?